Hello everyone, good morning. Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, number 122, Canan and Gaidheal, where we'll be looking at the language and the culture associated with Gaelic. Morning, John. So welcome, and to those of you who are not familiar with Learn with Lorna, I am Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness, Wick, Fort William and Portree. And together those 4 centres look after historic documents relating to this part of Scotland. We have millions and millions of documents in our collections dating over around 700 years of Highland history. And this series, which is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, is High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this. But if you're able to donate towards our work, as I know many of you have, we really are really grateful for that. And this series, as you'll know if you've watched before, was designed to bring some of the stories in our collections out to people who, when we were closed, couldn't get into our buildings. Now, of course, you are able to get in again, but we've continued to share these stories. Thank you for last week's comments. I'm really glad you enjoyed the episode on diaries. It was really nice to read some of your own stories about diaries as well. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and you can see why Catherine and I loved Reverend William Campbell's diary. If you didn't manage to watch last week's, then please do have a look back on YouTube where you can see all the previous episodes, all the previous 121 episodes. Thanks also to those who came along on Saturday to our event marking the 200th anniversary of the Caledonian Canal. It was really nice to meet some of you in person. I have this strange thing now where people know me and I don't know them, so it's lovely to meet some of you. This week is the final in our language and communication theme, and I'll be looking at the language most closely associated with the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, Gaelic. Apologies again for, I still have quite a sore throat. I've given, I think, 8 talks since I last spoke to you last week, so it's better, but it's not right, so apologies if I need to cough. Okay, so we're looking this week at Gaelic. And I'm keen to point out that although Gaelic is of course a language, that's only one aspect of Gaelic culture. So when you see the word referred to, you'll sometimes see it meaning something wider than just the Gaelic language, something that encompasses and includes music and culture and landscape and community and connection with all of those things, with the language holding it together. So as you'll know by now, I'm not a Gaelic speaker, so I have very few words, so as always my apologies for the pronunciation, but hopefully those of you who do speak will appreciate the attempt. So I'm going to use this session to look at the Gaelic language items that we have in our collections, and there's perhaps not nearly as many as people might expect us to have, but also to look at the places where the story of the Gaelic language most strikingly intersects with our collections, and where the references to Gaelic or the omissions of reference to Gaelic are particularly striking. And I'll explain more about that shortly. But I wanted to start by sharing with you a summary of the history of the Gaelic language and an overview of its current status, written by the Highland Council's Gaelic team. And this is what they write. Scottish Gaelic belongs to the Celtic family of languages, and, being the Q Celtic branch, is closely related to Irish Gaelic and Manx. The other Celtic languages of Welsh, Breton and Cornish, which belong to the P Celtic branch, are more distant cousins. Settlers brought Gaelic to Scotland from Antrim in Ireland over 1500 years ago, and it quickly spread from its initial base in what is now known as Gaelshire. At one time, Gaelic was the language of the Scottish court and of the majority of the country's population. Very few parts of Scotland, notably Caithness and the Northern Isles, were not Gaelic speaking at one time or another, and place names of recognisably Gaelic origin abound even in districts where the language was last spoken centuries ago. But Gaelic began to lose ground in the early Middle Ages as the Scots language made progress in southeast Scotland. Gaelic continued to flourish in the Highlands and Islands, particularly during the heyday of the Lordship of the Isles in the 14th and 15th centuries. But as the power and influence of the Lords of the Isles declined, Gaelic's status also weakened. The Statutes of Iona, enacted by the Scottish Parliament in the early 17th century, even went to the lengths of justifying its measures to undermine the language on the grounds that Gaelic in itself was one of the chief causes of barbarity in the Highlands and Islands. Economic hardship in the late 18th and 19th centuries resulted in both forced and voluntary emigration from the north of Scotland, which meant that many thousands of Gaelic speakers left for the industrialising lowlands or for the New World. This, together with factors such as the failure to give Gaelic its proper place when universal education was established in the late 19th century, caused the number of Gaelic speakers to decline. While Gaelic contracted both in While Gaelic contracted both in numerical and geographic terms in its native country, the number of those speaking the language in Canada actually rose due to the influx of so many immigrant Gaels. There remains Gaelic-speaking community in Cape Breton, and while their numbers remain dangerously low, its impact nationally and internationally in terms of music, song and the arts is considerable. Remarkably, after centuries of neglect and repression, Gaelic is still spoken by around 65,000 people in Scotland. It is strongest in the Western Isles, but there are substantial Gaelic communities elsewhere in the Highlands and Islands and in the nation's cities. Gaelic is currently enjoying a revival in its fortunes, with more interest being shown in the language and its health than at any other time. Crucial to supporting this revival have been developments in education and in promoting Gaelic culture. Gaelic playgroups and Gaelic medium education at both primary and secondary levels have undergone unprecedented growth in many areas of Scotland. Gaelic is increasingly used on road signs and in advertisements, and with the setting up of a fund to provide a Gaelic television service in 1992, more television and radio programmes are now available than in the past. At the same time, there has been a healthy and growing interest in Gaelic music and arts, and organisations such as Fashion and Gael and Blast Festival have been at the forefront of raising awareness and skills in Gaelic language, traditional music and song. The establishment of the Board na Gaelic, the Gaelic Board, to promote the language both in Scotland and around the world, builds on the work being done in this field by such bodies as Common na Gaelic, the Gaelic Councils and the Gaelic Association, and many local authorities, including the Highland Council. Gaelic has been spoken in Scotland for more than 60 generations, and the current generation of Gaels is united in its resolve to ensure that Gaelic remains a vital and vibrant language of the community. So that, I'm aware, is a kind of long thing for me to read out, but it's a good summary of where the language came from, the changes and the huge crushing moments it's gone through, and what the current status is. And there are a few things that I can pull out from that to link into our collections. There's reference there to that decline of the language. 500 years ago it was spoken by about 50% of the population. It's now less than 1%. So the decline, but also that determination to keep Gaelic language and culture alive. And completely and utterly linked to that, the extent to which Gaelic, again language and culture, is intertwined and bound up with politics. And I'll definitely come back to that. It's quite extraordinary the extent to which a language and its associated culture can be so tied to political decisions. But I wanted to first of all pick up on one particular point, that sentence there that says, place names of recognisably Gaelic origin abound even in districts where the language was last spoken centuries ago. And I went into this in some detail a few weeks ago when I looked at place names. So I won't go over that in detail, but I did want to just reiterate that connection between Gaelic and landscape. It's a very deep connection to a sense of place, a sense of nature, a deep connection to a place, a feeling of connection, belonging to a place. And one example of this link between language and nature is the fact that a common way to remember the 18 letters of the Gaelic alphabet is a method that's been used over generations, is by linking each letter to a tree species that can be found here. And these are those letters. And again, if you're a Gaelic speaker, please forgive me. But alum for A for elm, baith for birch, coll for hazel, dar for oak, aga for aspen, fiern for fern, gort for gorse, uath for hawthorn, yew for yew, lush for rowan, moon for vine, noon for ash, or owen for gorse, paith voic for downy birch, rush for elder, sul for willow, chena for whin, and for heather. So that a way of remembering the alphabet is linked to a different tree. Incidentally, for those who are wondering, there are 18 letters in the Gaelic alphabet. Those from the English alphabet that are not found in Gaelic are J, K, Q, V, W, X, Y, and Z. But that's a great example of how closely intertwined Gaelic is with landscape, and also the fact that representation of Gaelic in place names means that even those of us who don't speak the language will have some words thanks to the place names that surround us, and the words for plants and trees and so on. And I spoke a little bit about that in the Place Names Week, but a new favourite plant name that I have now, shared with me by Catherine in our Skyloch Archive Centre, is the Gaelic for the plant meadowsweet, which is Cneus cuchulainn, the belt of Cuchulainn. And why is it known as that? Well, because apparently the attempted cure for a very bad temper was to be bathed in the scent of that very sweet flower. And it worked so well that the Fingalian warrior Cuchulainn wore a flower of it on his belt ever after to prevent that bad temper. And again, it's that intertwined nature of language and legend and the natural landscape. I mentioned during the Place Names Week that we see a huge prevalence of Gaelic adjectives in our place names. So thousands of things that are referred to as flat, round, small, grey, dark, big, light, yellow, all of those different things. And we see that not only in our place names, but also elsewhere. So for instance, in the rent rolls that we hold in Skyloch Archive Centre, and these are records held by an estate where an estate will record the names of tenants who are living in each of their properties. And many of these rent rolls in Skyloch collections will give the person's name followed by an identifying adjective. So something like do or ban or more to say that they're, Donald, blonde Donald, or Big John, those kind of identifiers to distinguish them from someone else who has the same name, and often of the same family. And I wanted to share a little bit about that, a wee paragraph written by my colleague Catherine, which illustrates this point about using words to identify people and work out who they are. And she writes, "There is almost no question more important to the Scottish Gael than the question of belonging, Culishu, which means who do you belong to? It's a warm presumption, the Gaelic presumption, that we all belong somewhere. Families often have members with the same name. The father might be Murachach Mór, Big Murdo, and the son be Murachach Beg, Wee Murdo. In a culture where it is still not uncommon to honour one's father or mother by naming your child after his or her grandparents, people grow up having a unique identity in light of their parenthood." I really liked Catherine's sentence there about it's a warm presumption, the Gaelic presumption, that we all belong somewhere. And naming practices have historically been really important in Gaelic culture and in Scottish culture generally. Not only the use of Gaelic names, so there are names which maybe have an English equivalent, so we'll use Ian rather than John, Sheena rather than Jane or Janet, Hamish or Seamus for James, or Shoris for George, Alistair for Alexander. There are those names that have English equivalents. There are also names that are built on Gaelic meaning, so things like Morag for great, or Boyd for yellow, or Neil, which has various origins, but most commonly gets associated, I think, with the word champion. So there are names that carry that Gaelic tradition forward in first names, but also naming patterns that are used in Scotland that tell us something about the importance of family and that identity of who you belong to. So for instance, this pattern of naming, and there are variations on it, but often you'll find if you're tracing your family history that the eldest son has been named after the paternal grandfather, the second son after the maternal grandmother, second son after the maternal grandfather, third son after the father, and then the eldest daughter after the maternal grandmother, the second son after the paternal grandmother, and the third daughter after the mother. So you can see patterns and that importance of linking the generations backwards and forwards. There is, of course, also Gaelic is hugely prevalent in Scottish surnames, so the use of Mac for son of or Neek for daughter of. And this is how Scotland's people sum that pattern up. Mac is a prefix to surnames of Gaelic origin, meaning son. So for example, MacGoy translates to MacDonald, meaning son of Donald. You may come across the feminine version, Neek, an abbreviation of Nianvich, meaning daughter of Mac, attached to a woman's surname, so that might be further abbreviated to just N or NC. There are many examples of this in old parish registers, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. So for instance, you might find Neek Farlin, Neek Fee, but there are only isolated examples by the early 19th century. In earlier records, a person might not be known only by their father's name, but also by their grandfather's name. As such, you may come across the use of Vic, VC, meaning grandson or granddaughter. So for instance, in 1673 old parish registers, we can find Dougal, MacDougall, Vician, which means Dougal, son of Dougal, grandson of Ian. Some Mac surnames originated in occupations. For example, MacNab, son of the abbot, Macosh, son of the footman, MacMaster, son of the master or cleric. Others derive from distinguishing features. For example, Macalboy, son of the yellow-haired lad. Others contain vestiges of Norse influence. For example, Maciver, son of Iver, which is a Norse first name. Particularly since the Mac prefix was not the exclusive preserve of the Gaels, being adopted in some cases by the Norsemen and by some lowland Scots, particularly on the Highland peripheries. Many Mac surnames are no longer in use because they were abandoned because they were too difficult to pronounce, corrupted over years by phonetic spelling, or anglicised. And also, Mac surnames were written as MAC, MC, MHIC, or M apostrophe. And that's a point I'll come back to in a wee second. But again, you can see how intertwined Gaelic is, either with a sense of belonging, either to the land and the history, or to a particular family or particular group. And I wanted to share another little section that Catherine has written about this. And she's using a quote from Col Gordon, who does a podcast called Landed, which looks at this very specific subject. And Catherine says, the Skyloch Irish Archive may be known to some as Dulchus, which was its previous name. Dulchus is a complex Gaelic word, which means, and this is what Col's description of the word Dulchus. Dulchus is a complex Gaelic word, but essentially it's a feeling of belonging. Everything is linked. You belong to the land and the land belongs to you. Life around you is intertwined. Culture and ancestry. People before you keeping practices that are an accumulation of knowledge between the people, the land and the other. Gaelic concepts are a thick tapestry of words and ideas which make up a distinct world view or cosmology, which is very different from that of modern industrial societies. Similar concepts in other indigenous cultures about interconnectedness. So again, it's that real sense of belonging. Going back to that section on Scotland's people about the interchangeability of Mac and Mook and different spellings, it's a really interesting point, and it's a point that we constantly have to reiterate when people come in to visit us, that they are entirely interchangeable. because historically these words were dependent on who was writing them down. And so they would commonly appear in official documents written by people who spoke no Gaelic, and they were unable to be checked by those who did speak Gaelic because they couldn't read or write. And so if you add to that and throw into the mix the fact that fixed surnames didn't become common in the Highlands and Islands until the 1700s, and you can start to see how interchangeable that picture is and why there's no fixed spelling or fixed pattern always. Official records, almost every census is in Gaelic. Is in English, sorry. There is one rare example, the 1881 census entries for the parish of Creech in Sutherland, in which the names are written in Gaelic, which is very unusual. And the fact that it's unusual to find official documents, historic official documents in Gaelic, is absolutely representative of the language's position in our history and the speaker's position in our history. It's a language which has often been excluded or overlooked or prohibited, and often associated with rebellion and a sense of them and us. And that summary that I read out from the Highland Council at the beginning referenced the fact that Gaelic was described as, and I quote, one of the chief causes of barbarity in the Highlands and Islands. And that language was used as a representation of the culture and its speakers as a whole. And so efforts were made over centuries to stamp out the language and its associated culture and to tame the Highlands and Islands. And a way to do that is to remove a language's power, both in active and through active and passive means. So things like not including it in the Education Act. There are some references in our collections, in our school records, to Gaelic, and indeed pre-1872 there were Gaelic society schools and others which taught in the Gaelic medium. So we have letters in our collection. So for instance, in our Fraser Timber Merchants collection, which I've done a Learn with Lorna on, there are documents in there that refer to the real perceived need to teach via the Gaelic language. So, and that you can see that people were keen for it to happen. So for instance, we have a letter dated 27th of October 1819, there we go, written by Anne Chisholm of Fasnacail, and she is talking about the importance of introducing Gaelic schools. It's written in 1819. Gaelic society schools were around from about 1811, so it's probably those Gaelic society schools that she's referring to, and she says, I am deeply sensible of the benefit to be expected from Gaelic schools' introduction to this country, and also of your goodness in suggesting this matter. And there's also another letter from a few years later written by a William MacPhail from Nairn, and he's seeking work as a Gaelic school teacher. And he says, Dear Sir, having to a long and pretty extensive practice both in speaking and reading Gaelic, easily added a correct understanding of Stuart's grammar of that language, and being able at 1 week's warning to write a large text so completely free and accurate that a young clerk once told me by way of admiring its extreme accuracy, which seemed to detract from its freedom, your writing comes too near the copper plate. So he's saying, you know, I'm very good, I'm very capable, I can produce a piece of writing beautifully, very quickly. I therefore beg leave to offer myself as a candidate for some Gaelic school. And he's saying, if need be, I'll stop attending university if it helps promote the use of the language. So those are from the 1810s, 1820s, but we also have records from Raining's school collection before that, 1760s. One of them says, there being at present a great scarcity of persons having Irish Gaelic fit to teach in schools, and the great need of such, and the mortification being piously designed. So they're saying we're aware there's a lack of Gaelic teachers, but we think that the way this money has been given to us to set up this school, a justifiable use of the money would be to be maintaining the school, meaning maintaining children, so getting some children who are poor or fatherless and qualifying them to teach as Gaelic teachers in the Highlands and Islands. So there was obviously a need for it in the 1700s and the early 1800s. There is a Gaelic medium education, and there's a perceived need for that and benefit from it. And indeed, this is written slightly later, but written by the Reverend John MacLeod, when referring to examining Gaelic medium schools as opposed to children whose first language is Gaelic who are being taught in an English medium school. He says this: "To the examination of a Gaelic school I have always looked forward with pleasure. In the examination of our English schools there is general little interest. The children may read, and often do read with considerable correctness, but they are reading in what is to them a foreign language. But it is not this in the Gaelic school. In one word, in Gaelic schools the children understand what they are reading. Hence it is that Gaelic scholars cannot be kept from school, while English scholars cannot be whipped into regular attendance." So it's a very interesting point that no one's saying Gaelic education there is better than English education, but what they're saying is that they should be taught in the language that is their first language so that they can better understand what it is they're learning. And it's often said that the biggest blow to the Gaelic language came when it was excluded from the 1872 Education Scotland Act. This was a huge piece of legislation, and I've talked about it extensively over the years. It transformed education. It was the first time that it was compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 13 to go to school. But the Act made no reference to Gaelic at all. It didn't say anything negative about it, it just didn't mention it. And all children were taught in English. And that's a very quick and effective way of diminishing a language. There are references to Gaelic in Post-Education Act records relating to things like song in class, music being played, but many of the references that we find are connected to Gaelic speaking being a problem. So for instance, in Knockbreck School in 1890 in Skye, took charge of the school today. There was an attendance of 28 boys and 26 girls. I found the school in a very low state of educational efficiency, the greater number of children being unable to speak the English language. There's an Highland school logbook from 1875 that states, "Great difficulty is experienced in getting them to understand numeration in English. Many of them scarcely know their own names in that language." So it's not that the children are incapable of learning or there's in any way a problem with them. It's just that they're being taught something in a language that they don't understand to learn what it is they're learning. And a result of that omission to reference Gaelic in that act and the teaching of children in English is often seen as the final nail in the coffin for the common use of Gaelic across Scotland. Although of course it remains in common use in the Western Isles and various other places, and we do now have a number of Gaelic medium schools across the Highlands and Islands. But the result was that Gaelic became a language associated even more with music, song, poetry, lament, and connected to some extent with protest. And I mentioned that we don't have a huge number of documents written in Gaelic, but we do have some. And many of the places where Gaelic appears are connected to those things, to culture in one of its uses of the word, to music, to poetry, to lament and protest. And here are some further thoughts on that from Catherine. "When you enter the door at Skye Loch Alsh, you are welcomed by a portrait of Mary Vor na Oran, born Mary MacDonald in 1821. She left Skye for Inverness in 1847. Some of you may remember the Lorna I did on Mary Vor. Widowed by 1871, she was left with 4 children to care for alone. It was during a short imprisonment in 1872 on a charge of theft that she denied that she first turned to poetry, protesting her innocence and expressing her anger through Gaelic verse. Shortly after her release, Mary moved to Glasgow, where she trained as a nurse and worked there until 1882. While living there, she regularly attended Highland Society ceilidhs and met leading advocates of Highland land reform, and she became well known in these circles for her poetry and song. When she returned to Skye, she was the bard of the Land League agitation of the 1880s. She was a prolific songwriter from the age of 50, writing songs of exile, praise and hope, as well as songs of protest about the way the Gaels were treated by others. Her personal sense of injustice and empathy with the sufferings of her people gave a unique force to her poetry. Mary's genius perhaps lies in her assured application of praise and dispraise to the modern political and social realities of her day. In the case of the Battle of Braes, she singles out the active role of women in the protest and the brutality of the response to their resistance. With inclusive satire, she challenges any abuse by authority at the expense of the Gaels. Mary Vore wrote about the Highland women who rioted during the Battle of the Braes, Oran Ben Lee, the Song of Ben Lee, and in English it includes the line, "The gentlest of women, most graceful in movement, their heads were broken on the Braes of Ben." And so we see Gaelic associated with those subjects, with poetry, with protest, with sorrow or lament. And at Skye and Lochailsh archives, sometimes in our other archive centres as well, but particularly in Skye and Lochailsh, Gaelic poetry and song is often used as part of our exhibitions. And it does make an appearance in other collections as well, as I say, sometimes connected again with protest or calls for rights. And these, here's Catherine again detailing some of the uses, some of the collections where it's referred to. We hold collections in Gaelic, including many books including poetry, songs in our libraries, and a selection of records that can be seen and heard on Ambala. But she describes one of the court records that they hold, an 1862 summons, Robertson against Kennedy. Donald Robertson, shepherd, Wood of Kinloch, pursuer. He's saying that Anne Kennedy, residing at the Wood of Kinloch, is owing the complainer the sum of £10 sterling for damages to the pursuer's character or feelings, because on a day in the month of September last, or about that time at Kinloch, in the presence of Angus Mackintosh, shepherd at Kinloch, hearing of Roderick Mackinnon maliciously and falsely asserted in the Gaelic language that the pursuer was a thief and had stolen sheep or lambs. And it says, here are the words that he used. And there's a section in that record that lists in Gaelic the words of abuse that were used. But the document has with it no English translation. So it shows that both Gaelic and English were recorded when they needed to be in court cases. In another court record, we have the case of Dougal MacLachlan, Sheriff Clerk Depute at Portree, who acted as the Gaelic interpreter for the Napier Commission in 1883. From 1882 to 1886, he was investigated by Sheriff Ivory under suspicion of inappropriate support of the Crofters' War. 1882, MacLachlan, having played the role of the mediator between the landlord and the Braes Crofters, he proposed a visit to Braes to meet with the Crofters. But he was accused of being basically far too soft and supporting them. His work as the Skye interpreter for the Napier Commission was registered at the Commission's last session, as the bulk of the evidence was given in Gaelic. And it does say that he had gone round and performed the task of interpreting what was said on both sides to the satisfaction of all concerned. So there are references in those collections, but they often seem to come up in places where there is a two-sided argument. It is very hard to tell the story of a language in half an hour, and particularly a language that is so bound up in landscape, in politics, in upheaval, in a sense of place, and a language which has been declining for centuries while also being championed and promoted and cherished and treasured by so many people. Gaelic is a language and a culture that is still very much alive, and it's still the first or second language of many. And of course, as well as those Gaelic medium schools, we now also have Salmarostig, the higher education college, which is a partner of the University of the Highlands and Islands, which teaches exclusively its degree courses in the Gaelic medium. And it was lovely seeing Catherine's point made to me that it's located on a piece of land which is called the Tongue, which is lovely. But I wanted to finish by sharing an article written in 1989 in the Portree High School magazine, written by the headmaster at the time, Gerald Morgan, after Portree High School students hosted a group of Welsh students. And the article is held in the magazine in our Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre, and he reflects on the benefits to anybody of being bilingual in any languages. Teachers interested in the survival of Gaelic who come to Wales often turn green with envy. They see the 67 Welsh medium primary schools in the anglicised areas of Wales. They see several hundred other primary schools teaching Welsh and through Welsh in the Welsh-speaking areas of Wales. They see 17 Welsh medium secondary schools and 40 other secondary schools which teach 10 or more subjects using Welsh language. The shock can be considerable. Suspicious people want to know why it happened. The sympathetic want to know how it happened. Let's take the why first. It's a question usually asked by people who can only speak one language, who don't realise that most of the world's population is bilingual and don't realise how much richer life can be with two languages. They cannot hear the land speaking to them through the names of hills, streams, villages, farms and fields. They cannot hear it speak through literature and history, geography and natural science. All they know is that they can speak English in Wales and they can be understood, so why worry? Yet to belong to the Welsh-speaking family, one must be able to speak Welsh or remain forever a visitor. They don't see that if this is the language of my parents and my grandparents, then I must hand it on to my children. That if I have lost the language, then it's my responsibility to ensure that my children are not so deprived. And to do that, schools must be able to teach them. Of course, not all incomers are deaf and blind. They know that they may not be able to master what is an easy language, but they want it for their children who can learn quickly and easily. What is essential for the child is that the language has prestige. It must be associated with prestige, with institutions like schools. If the school not only teaches Welsh but uses it, then the child will learn and accept it. So then how did it happen? Slowly, very slowly, through the painful efforts of individuals, through parents who set up playgroups, through the spread from primary to secondary. A century ago you would be punished for speaking Welsh in school. The rush for English was like the flight of the Garradine swine. Of course people needed English, but they could have learned English better and more quickly if they had made use of their first language instead of trying to deny it, a denial which does great psychological damage. Today pupils in Welsh medium secondary get excellent English results. Why? Because they have a double dose of language learning. The whole message, spelling, sentence, paragraph, writing, essays, readings, is all doubled up. It may be difficult to believe, but Welsh for all means better English for all, and it doesn't mean giving up French or German. A bilingual education is a better education. A bilingual Scottish education, using Gaelic of course, would be the best of all. And I think that's a very lovely summary, but as you know, I've mentioned before, I studied language and linguistics at university, and I know from that if you have one language, it's all the more easy to learn another language. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope to those of you who are Gaels and are Gaelic speakers, you feel that I've done justice to your language and your culture. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're interested in finding out more about the language or how to learn Gaelic, then I would recommend looking at Learn Gaelic or any of those places I've spoken about, the Common Gaelic and so on. If you're interested in some of the pronunciations and where I get my pronunciations from, there is a fantastic website called the Gaelic Dictionary, which gives pronunciations for each word. It's invaluable to me. Next week, I hope you can join me. We'll be looking at one specific collection held in our Lochaber archives, which is the Cameron Head of Inverleith collection. A really interesting collection, so I hope you can join me for that. Thank you again for joining and for sharing your comments with me. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. Thank you for joining me, and thank you especially to my colleague Catherine in Skye for all her insights and examples from the collections in Skye and Lochaber. Thank you.